Hold still. Not because I'm asking nicely, but because something just shifted, and the streets can feel it before your brain does. You hear that low static under the noise of the world? That isn't fear. That's reality recalibrating around you. Because someone with a name, a title, a reputation they spent years building brick by brick, lit a match and burned their entire status for you. No hesitation, no safety net. They didn't trip, they didn't slip, they chose you. And now the system is stuttering. People are refreshing feeds that aren't loading. Group chats are freezing mid-sentence. The streets are glitching because the math doesn't add up anymore. You weren't supposed to be worth that. See, status is sacred currency in this world. It's blood-earned. It's guarded like a relic. People sell their souls just to keep a fraction of it. They betray friends. They swallow truth. They kneel quietly, all to protect their little crown. And yet, someone looked at you and decided, yeah, I'll torch mine for that. That's not loyalty. That's not kindness. That's recognition. That's when the saint and the psychopath shake hands in the same body. That's when the angel says, I see the light, and the demon says, I'll go first. Because you don't inspire safe behavior. You inspire irreversible decisions. People don't burn status for potential. They burn it for inevitability. They burn it when they realize you're not climbing the hierarchy. You're bending it. And here's the part that's making the streets twitch. You didn't ask for it. You didn't campaign. You didn't beg for alignment. You just kept moving with that quiet, unexplainable gravity. That look in your eyes that says you've already died once and came back with better instincts. That calm that unnerves people who need applause to breathe. You evolved through pain so completely that chaos stopped recognizing you as prey. You became the paradox. Too moral to be controlled, too dangerous to be ignored, too unpredictable to be framed. That's why when they burned their status for you, the system didn't celebrate. It panicked. Because status is supposed to flow upward, from weak to powerful, from desperate to dominant. But this time it flowed sideways. It defected. It said, I'm not backing the throne. I'm backing the anomaly. And anomalies break algorithms. Now watch closely, because this is where it gets ugly and beautiful at the same time. The ones who never defended you, they're suddenly quiet, not because they respect you, but because they're recalculating their survival. The ones who mocked you, they're rewriting history in their heads, trying to remember when they always believed in you. And the ones who understand power, they're scared in a very specific way. Not scared of you attacking them, scared of standing on the wrong side of you when the next sacrifice happens. Because once someone burns their entire status for you, it sends a signal through the underground. A signal that says, this one doesn't need permission. This one doesn't need consensus. This one makes people choose sides without asking. That's war doctrine energy. That's when your existence becomes a pressure test for everyone around you. Their masks slip, their values shake, their courage gets audited in real time. And you're just standing there, watching the world reveal itself. That's the duality they can't stomach. You're calm while empires sweat, silent while narratives collapse, still while reputations combust in your orbit. They want to call it luck. They want to call it manipulation. They want to call it insanity. But deep down, the truth crawls under their skin. You're the kind of force that makes people gamble everything without knowing why. That's not charm. That's alignment with something older and darker than social rules. You didn't become this by being nice. You became this by surviving moments that would have erased softer versions of you, by letting pain strip you down to what actually works, by learning when to be merciful and when to let the fire speak for you. That's why the streets are glitching, because they're realizing the scariest thing about you isn't what you do. It's what people are willing to destroy for you. And this is just the beginning. Once the first status burns, others follow. Not out of loyalty, but out of fear of being late to the shift. So don't rush, don't explain, don't reassure anyone. Let them watch, let them guess, let them malfunction, trying to understand a presence that doesn't need validation to bend reality. You're not the headline, you're the reason headlines get rewritten, and somewhere deep in the system, an alarm is still ringing, because it finally understands what it let through. Not a hero, not a villain, a disruption with intent. And the streets, they're not glitching because something broke. They're glitching because you're no longer playing by rules that recognize them. And here's the part nobody warns you about. When someone burns their entire status for you, it stains the air. People don't just notice it consciously, they feel it. Like a pressure change before a storm, like animals going silent right before the ground splits. That's why rooms behave differently when you walk in now. Conversations shorten, eyes linger half a second too long. People laugh a little louder than necessary, or not at all, because the unconscious mind already did the math. It clocked the sacrifice. It registered the loss. It understood that someone with everything to lose chose you over safety. And the human brain hates one thing more than danger: unexplainable loyalty to the wrong variable. That's why they're unsettled. They keep asking themselves questions they'll never say out loud. What does he have? What did they see? What does he know that I don't? What happens if I'm standing in the way when this keeps escalating? Because escalation is inevitable now. Status doesn't burn in isolation. It sends heat down the chain. It exposes weak welds. It reveals who was only powerful because no one tested the structure. And you didn't light the fire. You just existed at the exact frequency that made combustion unavoidable. That's the paradox that terrifies them. You didn't threaten. You didn't coerce. You didn't demand allegiance. You simply became undeniable. That's when the saint in you scares the world more than the psychopath ever could. Because saints don't negotiate with corrupt systems. They outgrow them. And psychopaths, they just accelerate what was already cracking. You learn to carry both without flinching. You learn when to forgive without forgetting. When to stay silent without shrinking. When to let chaos do the explaining so your hands stayed clean. That balance, that's what makes people burn themselves for you. Because deep down, they sense something precise. If they stand next to you, they might lose everything. But if they stand against you, they might lose who they are. So they choose loss with meaning over survival without dignity. That's not persuasion, that's gravity. Now let's talk about the ones pretending this didn't shake them. They'll downplay it publicly. They'll say, it wasn't that serious. It didn't matter anyway. They were overrated. But watch their behavior. Watch how they stop making jokes around you. Watch how they hesitate before disagreeing. Watch how their energy turns cautious, strategic, rehearsed. Because confidence doesn't need rehearsal, fear does. They're afraid not of your power, but of your trajectory. They can feel that you're not peaking, you're transitioning. And transitions are dangerous because they're non-linear. No milestones, no warnings, just sudden shifts where yesterday's rules evaporate. That's why the streets are glitching. Reality itself doesn't like untrackable entities. Systems rely on patterns, on predictability, on people repeating who they were yesterday, so tomorrow stays manageable. But you broke that contract when pain forced you to evolve faster than the environment could adapt. You didn't harden, you didn't soften, you refined. You became selective with empathy, precise with anger, surgical with silence. And once someone burned their status for you, the unspoken truth went public. You're not protected by position, you're protected by outcome. People defend you not because they owe you, but because they sense that aligning with you places them on the correct side of history, even if history hasn't announced itself yet. That's why the air feels electric. That's why random opportunities appear without explanation. Why doors open sideways instead of forward. Why obstacles dissolve instead of resisting. Not because you're lucky, because reality reallocates resources toward forces that can handle consequences. You've already proven you can survive the fallout. You've already walked through loss without begging the world to be fair. You already paid the entry fee most people avoid their whole lives. So now the system adjusts. And the ones who sense this, they're scrambling. Some will try to attach themselves to you opportunistically. Some will test you, hoping to provoke a mistake they can weaponize. Some will disappear quietly, knowing absence is safer than opposition. Let them. You don't chase alignment anymore. You let it reveal itself. Because after someone burns their entire status for you, one thing becomes clear. You're no longer asking permission to exist at this level. You're being reacted to. And reaction is proof of dominance the loud never understand. So stay calm, stay observant, stay exact. You don't need to explain why the streets are glitching. They already know. They just don't know what comes after. And that uncertainty, that's your real power now. And here's what really fractures them. You're not intoxicated by this moment. Most people would flex, they'd posture, they'd start speaking louder, faster, messier. They'd leak their intentions, trying to taste control, but you didn't. You absorbed it the way predators absorb silence. You noticed the shift and did nothing reckless with it. That restraint, that's what tells the sharp ones this isn't a phase, because power that announces itself is still insecure. Power that waits is already finished calculating. They keep trying to locate the move you're making next, not realizing the move already happened when someone sacrificed everything for you and you didn't flinch. That moment rewrote your profile in every serious mind watching. You became the kind of presence that doesn't need momentum. Momentum starts needing you. That's why the streets feel off balance. Because influence just detached from noise and reattached to something quiet, patient, and precise. You didn't step into the spotlight. The spotlight followed you, then realized it couldn't keep up. And here's the brutal truth most won't admit even to themselves. People don't burn their status for leaders. They burn it for forces. Leaders still belong to structures. Forces make structures obsolete. That's why some of them feel betrayed without knowing by whom. That's why resentment is mixing with awe in their chests. That's why they're trying to morally label you hero, villain, threat, savior, anything that shrinks you back into a category they understand. But you don't fit. You're the result of contradictions surviving together without canceling each other out. You can be compassionate without being weak. You can be dangerous without being chaotic. You can forgive without reopening access. You can walk away without losing leverage. That synthesis, that's what breaks people who only learned one side of themselves. They had to choose masks. You became the face underneath. And when someone burned their status for you, it publicly confirmed what many privately feared. You're not powered by approval. You're powered by alignment with consequence. You don't say things you can't stand behind. You don't make moves you can't survive. You don't threaten outcomes you haven't already rehearsed emotionally. That's why your calm unsettles them more than aggression ever could. Because aggression can be provoked. Calm means the decision already passed through the nervous system and came out clean. They feel it when you look at them, not judgment, not superiority, assessment. And assessment makes liars nervous. That's why conversations with you feel heavier now. Why jokes land flatter. Why people either open up too much or shut down completely. Your presence pressures truth to surface. And the streets, oh, the streets know. They don't speak in words, they speak in behavior. Watch who suddenly avoids crossing paths with you. Watch who starts showing respect they never practiced before. Watch who becomes excessively polite, excessively neutral, excessively careful. Those are survival responses. Because once a status burns for you, everyone subconsciously asks one question: if I had to choose, would I? And not everyone likes their answer. Some realize they'd hesitate. Some realize they'd protect themselves. Some realize they'd betray first just to feel safe. And realizing that about yourself is humiliating. That's why they project. That's why they whisper. That's why they spin narratives to regain psychological altitude. But none of it lands, because you're not fighting perception battles anymore. You're letting time expose consistency. You're letting outcomes stack quietly. You're letting pressure do what it always does: reveal structure. And here's the part that seals it. You don't even need that person who burned their status for you anymore. That's what really destabilizes the system. The sacrifice didn't chain you. It freed you. It announced that you are worth irreversible costs. And then you proved you're not dependent on them. That combination, that's lethal to hierarchies, because hierarchies thrive on leverage, on obligation, on keeping people tethered through debt and fear. You don't collect either. You let people choose, and choice under pressure exposes everything. So now the streets glitch, not because chaos arrived, but because clarity did. The illusion that status equals power just cracked. The myth that safety comes from conformity just slipped. The lie that silence means insignificance just collapsed. You're standing proof that evolution doesn't ask permission. It takes its shape from pain, pressure, and patience. And the ones who feel it most? They're not angry at you. They're angry that they didn't become you when pain gave them the same invitation. So keep moving the way you've been moving. Unannounced, unhurried, unafraid. Let them glitch. Let them stutter. Let them guess. You're no longer participating in the game they understand. You're what happens after someone sets fire to the board, and reality still bends toward you anyway. And now comes the quietest, most dangerous phase. The part where nothing visibly happens, but everything irreversible is already in motion. This is where weak minds relax. This is where loud egos assume the storm passed. This is where people mistake your silence for stalling. But you know better. You've lived long enough in pressure to recognize the sound of steel cooling after it's been forged. Because after someone burns their entire status for you, the world doesn't explode immediately. It reorganizes. Power starts rerouting underground. Respect stops asking permission to be expressed. Attention shifts without announcements. And you feel it in subtle ways. People start mentioning your name in rooms you're not in. Decisions are delayed until your reaction is predicted. Plans are adjusted to account for a variable no one fully understands. You. Not because you demanded relevance, because relevance attached itself to you when the sacrifice happened. That's what most people don't understand about status burnings. It's not about the person who loses it, it's about what their loss authorizes next. Their fall creates a vacuum, and vacuums don't stay empty. They get filled by the most structurally sound presence nearby. That's you. You didn't step forward. You didn't raise your hand. You didn't claim leadership. You were simply the only one not shaking when the cost became visible. That composure rewired how people categorize you. You moved from interesting to consequential, from talented to dangerously inevitable, from watch him to adjust for him. And adjustment is submission's quiet cousin. Now watch what happens next. Some will try to recreate the sacrifice theatrically, burning their own little scraps of status loudly, hoping to mirror the effect. But it won't land, because the original burn worked for one reason only. It wasn't strategic. It was instinctual, visceral, uncomfortable. It came from a place deeper than ambition. Recognition mixed with fear, mixed with respect. That's not something you can fake. That's why their imitations look desperate, why their gestures feel hollow, why people sense the difference without being able to articulate it. They didn't burn for a force, they burned for optics, and optics don't glitch reality. Forces do. You've become a force, not because you wanted power, but because you stopped being scared of what power costs. You've already paid in advance. You've paid with isolation, with misunderstanding, with being ahead of people emotionally and morally before they were ready. You've paid by being misjudged while still moving correctly, by choosing discipline when chaos would have felt justified, by swallowing rage and turning it into precision. That's why when someone else burned everything for you, it didn't inflate you. It confirmed what you already survived, and confirmation is stabilizing. That's why you're not rushing to capitalize. You're letting gravity do the work. You're letting the ones who sense the shift approach you naturally, and the ones who don't remove themselves quietly. Because you're not building a crowd, you're allowing alignment, and alignment is ruthless. It filters without apology. It excludes without explanation. It gathers only what can withstand proximity to consequence. This is where the saint in you becomes terrifying, because you won't exploit the chaos. And this is where the psychopath in you stays disciplined, because you know exactly how much damage you could do, and choose timing instead. That restraint tells the world one thing loud and clear. You're not reactive, you're inevitable. And inevitability scares people more than violence ever could. Violence can be stopped. Inevitability can only be prepared for or avoided. That's why some are disappearing, why some are overcompensating, why some are suddenly trying to redefine their values publicly. They're trying to future-proof themselves against a presence they can't predict. But prediction isn't your weakness. Unpredictability is. You don't move randomly. You move unannounced. You don't escalate emotionally. You escalate structurally. And once people realize that, they stop trying to provoke you, because they sense that provoking you doesn't trigger anger. It triggers repositioning. So let the streets keep glitching. Let the noise continue misfiring. Let the world struggle to understand why the center of gravity moved without a headline. You're not here to explain the shift. You're here to embody it. Someone burned their entire status for you, and the system didn't collapse. It adjusted toward you. That's not coincidence. That's not hype. That's not narrative. That's what happens when evolution recognizes one of its own. And from here on out, every reaction you cause without effort, every door that opens without knocking, every silence that follows your name. That's not respect. That's acknowledgement. And acknowledgement is the last thing the old world gives before it steps aside. Pause right there. Yeah, that silence you just felt. That's the sound of rooms going quiet because your last move is being replayed, frame by frame, by people who thought they understood power. You didn't make a decision. You shifted doctrine. Right now, somewhere you'll never be invited. Minds that once dismissed you are dissecting why the move worked, how it violated every known pattern, and what kind of person thinks like that without flinching. They're not asking what you did anymore. They're asking what you are. Because that last move, it didn't look aggressive. It didn't look loud. It didn't even look smart at first. That's what terrifies them. See, amateurs announce, professionals execute. But you moved like someone who already knew how the board would respond before the pieces even realized they were being touched. You moved like restraint, weaponized, like patience sharpened into a blade, like someone who understands that the most devastating force isn't chaos, it's controlled unpredictability. They're studying you now like a battlefield anomaly, not because you were brutal, but because you were precise. You didn't lash out like a psychopath. You didn't freeze like a saint. You stood exactly in between, where angels learn how to bleed and demons learn how to wait. That's the paradox they can't digest. They were trained to recognize rage. They were trained to counter ambition. They were trained to survive monsters. But you didn't arrive as a monster. You arrived calm. You arrived reasonable. You arrived looking like someone who could be underestimated. And that's where the doctrine breaks. Because every system on Earth is designed to stop force, not clarity. Your move didn't scream. It didn't posture. It didn't beg for attention. It ended conversations. Now rewind it. Look at what really happened. You absorbed pain long enough to understand structure. You let betrayal teach you leverage. You let isolation teach you timing. You let being underestimated train you in invisibility. Most people break when the world hits them. You didn't break. You learned how the impact travels. That's why the move landed the way it did. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't reactive. It was evolutionary. They're writing notes about it now, trying to reverse engineer your restraint, trying to map your silence, trying to figure out how someone survives pressure without leaking intention. They won't admit this part out loud, but it's there in the margins of their analysis. This wasn't instinct. This wasn't luck. This was trained suffering. And that's what separates you from everyone who tried to play the same game, louder. You learned when not to move. You learned when not to speak. You learned when not to win. Because sometimes the most violent thing you can do to an opponent is let them think they're safe, while they walk themselves into irrelevance. That's not madness. That's not mercy. That's doctrine. You see, saints collapse under the weight of their own purity. Psychopaths implode from impatience. But you fused discipline with darkness. You let the angel in you understand consequence. You let the demon in you understand delay. And that balance, that's what terrifies institutions, hierarchies, and fragile egos that rely on predictability to survive. They can't profile you anymore. They can't provoke you. They can't bait you. Because the last time they thought they had you figured out, you moved sideways while they prepared for a frontal war. That's why the move is being studied, not for what it did, but for what it revealed. It revealed that you don't operate on impulse. You operate on pressure geometry. You know where tension accumulates. You know where silence becomes unbearable. You know where people will overextend trying to feel in control again. And you let them. That's the part they hate, because it means the next move won't come from anger. It won't come from desperation. It won't come from ego. It'll come from the same place the last one did. A place that already survived the worst-case scenario. You're not playing to win anymore. You're playing to reshape the environment. And environments don't argue back. They just adapt or collapse. So let them study it. Let them debate it. Let them call it unorthodox, dangerous, or concerning. They always do when doctrine changes. Just understand this. When your pain turns into strategy, when your restraint becomes unreadable, when your silence starts dictating behavior, you're no longer reacting to the world. The world is reacting to you. And that last move, that wasn't the end of the war. That was the page where the old rules quietly stopped applying. And here's the part they don't teach in any manual, any academy, any leadership seminar they charge desperate people thousands to attend. Once doctrine shifts, it never goes back. They're still pretending this was a one-off, a fluke, a lucky alignment of chaos. That's how fragile systems cope when they feel something move beneath them. They tell themselves stories so they can sleep. But deep down, they know the truth is far more uncomfortable. Your last move wasn't situational. It was structural. It exposed something they can't unsee now. It showed them that power doesn't always announce itself with volume or violence. Sometimes power just withdraws consent from the old rules. And when that happens, everything built on those rules starts shaking. They're not studying you to copy you. They're studying you to defend against you. And that's the real promotion, because nobody builds defenses against people they don't fear becoming relevant. Notice what changed after that move. Conversations shifted tone, responses slowed down. Certain people stopped testing you altogether, not because they suddenly respected you, but because they felt something unfamiliar crawl up their spine. Uncertainty. You didn't just win. You made them unsure how to engage. That's a nightmare for anyone who survives by dominance, manipulation, or pattern recognition. They need you predictable. They need you emotional. They need you loud, reactive, desperate for acknowledgement. But you denied them all of it. You didn't escalate. You didn't retreat. You repositioned. That's why they're tearing it apart now, frame by frame, motive by motive, trying to locate the moment where you gave yourself away. And they can't find it, because the truth is brutal. There was no leak, no tell, no emotional residue. What they saw was the result of someone who already accepted loss long before the move was made. You see, only people who've already lost everything are free enough to think like you did. That's the paradox. The saint in you learned endurance. The psychopath in you learned detachment. But neither one is in control anymore. What's in control now is something colder, quieter, sharper. Experience. You've been humiliated without breaking, ignored without begging, cornered without panicking. So when the moment came, you didn't react like someone fighting for survival. You moved like someone testing gravity. And gravity always wins. They're trying to map your psychology now, trying to label you so they can feel superior again. Strategic thinker, dark empath, cold operator, lucky opportunist. Anything that reduces you to a word they already understand. But words won't hold you, because your mind doesn't operate on identity anymore. It operates on outcome. You don't need to be seen as good. You don't need to be feared openly. You don't even need to be remembered accurately. You just need the environment to behave differently after you touch it, and it does. That's why the aftermath is louder than the move itself. People over-explaining, over-justifying, over-correcting. They're not reacting to what you did. They're reacting to the realization that someone like you exists. Someone who can absorb pressure without exploding. Someone who can wait without rotting. Someone who can strike without hating. That combination is illegal in most power structures. Hatred makes people sloppy. Love makes them blind. Fear makes them loud. But clarity makes people unfair. And that's what you became. Unfair to predict. Unfair to challenge. Unfair to contain. They'll say your move was ruthless. They always do when they realize kindness isn't available to them anymore. But here's the truth they'll never say out loud. You weren't ruthless. You were finished negotiating with your past. Every ounce of pain you survived trained you for that exact moment. Every betrayal sharpened your timing. Every night you thought about quitting rewired your tolerance for uncertainty. So when it was time, you didn't flinch. That's not cruelty. That's evolution. And now the doctrine spreads. Not through imitation, but through fear. Others start hesitating where they used to rush, overthinking where they used to dominate, checking themselves when your name enters the equation. Because once someone proves they can break pattern without breaking themselves, the game changes forever. They can keep studying the move. They can write papers, hold meetings, draft counter strategies. But doctrine isn't defeated by preparation. It's defeated by another doctrine. And you're already building the next one, quietly, invisibly, without permission. So stay calm, stay unreadable, stay just human enough to be underestimated and just dangerous enough to be left alone. Because the moment they understand you completely is the moment you've already moved again. And this time, they won't even know which rule you just erased. Good. Stay right here in this moment, because what happens after doctrine shifts is where most people lose their nerve. See, making the move isn't the hardest part. Anyone reckless enough can gamble once. Anyone emotional enough can burn everything down in a single blaze of glory. But living after the move, that's where power exposes who's real. Because now the world is watching you differently. Not openly, not honestly, but carefully. They don't challenge you the same way. They don't test you head-on anymore. Instead, they probe, they circle, they send feelers disguised as compliments, questions disguised as concern, silence disguised as respect. This is the containment phase. And here's what they still don't understand. You noticed. You always notice. You see the pauses before replies. You hear the hesitation behind confidence. You feel the recalibration happening in real time. That's because once you've lived through pressure without collapsing, you develop a sixth sense for instability. You don't need chaos to announce itself. You feel it in the air, like static before a storm. They're uneasy now because your move revealed something deeply inconvenient. You don't need momentum, you generate it. Most people need conditions to be right. You learn to operate when conditions were hostile. Most people rely on validation to continue. You learn to function in isolation. Most people escalate when threatened. You lowered your temperature and let gravity do the damage. That's why the move still echoes. Because it wasn't fueled by adrenaline, it was fueled by acceptance. You had already accepted the worst outcome. You had already grieved what you could lose. So when the time came, there was nothing left to threaten you with. That's the moment a person becomes ungovernable. Not loud, not rebellious, ungovernable. Rules only work on people who fear consequences. Manipulation only works on people who need approval. Pressure only works on people who still believe safety is promised. You don't believe any of that anymore. And that's not because you're broken, it's because you're awake. The saint in you learned compassion through suffering. The demon in you learned restraint through discipline. But the fusion? The fusion learned timing. You no longer rush to be understood. You no longer rush to be right. You no longer rush to finish battles. You let people reveal themselves. You let systems overextend. You let enemies underestimate the quiet. Because you know something they don't want to admit. Power doesn't come from force. It comes from position. And position is earned by surviving moments that were supposed to erase you. That's why the doctrine spreads slowly at first. Not as imitation, but as hesitation. People pause where they used to act. Second guess where they used to dominate. You introduced doubt into places that thrived on certainty. That's more disruptive than violence. Violence creates resistance. Doubt creates paralysis. They don't know whether to confront you, collaborate with you, or avoid you. And that ambiguity, that liminal space, is where influence quietly accumulates. You're not taking territory anymore. You're changing behavior. That's empire-level impact. And here's the cruel irony. The more disciplined you become, the more they project chaos onto you. They'll call you cold because you're no longer reactive, dangerous because you're no longer predictable, ruthless because you stopped offering access to your inner world. Let them. Labels are how frightened minds try to shrink what they can't control. You didn't lose your humanity, you prioritized it. You stopped wasting empathy on people who only learned how to exploit it. You stopped explaining yourself to systems designed to misunderstand you. That's not darkness, that's discernment. And discernment looks like menace to those who survive on manipulation. So now, every move you don't make becomes as loud as the one you did. Every silence carries weight. Every decision, even delay, gets analyzed for intent. That's when you know you've crossed a threshold. When even your stillness alters the board. So don't rush the next move. Don't announce it. Don't romanticize it. Let them keep studying the last one while you evolve beyond the version of yourself they think they're tracking. Because doctrine doesn't repeat. It mutates, and You're not here to win one war. You're here to prove that someone forged in pressure can rewrite the rules without raising their voice. And leave behind a battlefield where no one can tell exactly when the war was already over. And here's the quiet truth that settles in after the echoes fade. Once a doctrine is born, it doesn't need your permission to keep spreading. You feel it now, don't you? That subtle shift in how the world leans when you enter a space. The way reactions come half a beat slower. The way confidence around you feels rehearsed. People are no longer responding to you. They're responding to the possibility of you. That's power at its most dangerous, because now you're no longer dealing with opposition. You're dealing with anticipation. They're not waiting to see what you'll do. They're waiting to see when. And anticipation corrodes the mind. It drains energy. It forces mistakes. You see, when people don't understand the rules anymore, they start playing defense against ghosts. They prepare for attacks that never come. They waste resources, bracing for angles you've already abandoned. Meanwhile, you stay still. That restraint, that discipline, that refusal to perform is exactly what sharpens your edge. You're not feeding their expectations, you're starving them. And starvation changes behavior faster than fear ever could. You didn't just show them a move, you showed them a mind that doesn't need permission to operate. That's why they can't shake it. because your move didn't fit their narratives. It didn't validate their worldview. It didn't confirm their hierarchy. It quietly exposed that the system they trust doesn't account for someone who's already transcended its incentives. You don't need applause. You don't need revenge. You don't need closure. You already passed through the part of life where those things mattered. Pain burned the excess out of you. Loss stripped the illusions. Isolation clarified the signal. So when you moved clean. And clean moves terrify messy systems because they can't corrupt what they can't access. They can't threaten what already made peace with loss. They can't bait what no longer reacts emotionally to provocation. That's why your silence feels louder now. That's why your restraint feels aggressive. That's why your calm feels confrontational. They're projecting. They always do when someone refuses to play the emotional games that keep the hierarchy intact. And here's the part they still haven't realized. You're not calculating domination. You're calculating stability. You don't want chaos. You don't want spectacle. You want leverage that lasts. You want outcomes that hold even when attention moves on. That's the mindset of someone who's done being a moment and started becoming a constant. They'll try to pull you back into reaction. They'll poke at old wounds, resurrect narratives they think still have hooks in you. They'll test your patience, hoping to see a crack, a tell, a regression to something familiar. But you don't live there anymore. You remember who you were before the pain, but you're not loyal to that version. You honor them by becoming something sharper, quieter, more precise. That's growth they can't frame as inspirational, so they label it dangerous. Good. Danger is just clarity they can't control. And as time passes, you'll notice something else. The doctrine will outgrow the move. People will stop referencing what you did and start referencing what they can't do anymore. They'll say things like, "That won't work now," or "You can't move like that anymore," without ever saying your name. That's when you know the shift is complete, when your influence becomes environmental. So keep evolving. Keep shedding versions of yourself that were built to survive smaller worlds. Let the angel and the demon argue in the background while something more refined makes the decisions. Because the last move you made wasn't just studied like a war doctrine. It proved that the most unstoppable force isn't aggression or brilliance or even courage. It's someone who has suffered enough to think clearly and lived long enough in the dark to choose exactly when to step into the light. And when you do, they won't call it a move anymore. They'll call it inevitability. And that's where it ends. Not with noise, not with celebration, not with you standing over anything you destroyed. It ends with acceptance. They accept that something changed the moment you moved. They accept that the old tactics don't reach you. They accept that you're no longer reacting, you're deciding. You don't need to chase dominance. You don't need to prove intelligence. You don't need to announce intent. Your existence already forced revision. That last move didn't crown you a winner. It marked you as a reference point. From now on, people won't ask, "What should we do?" They'll ask, "What happens if someone like you is watching?" And that's the quiet victory. Because wars aren't won by the loudest strike. They're won when the enemy changes behavior before you even lift your hand. So walk forward, calm. Let the angel keep your conscience intact. Let the demon keep your edge sharp. You've crossed the line where power needs explanation. From here on out, your silence is strategy. Your restraint is threat. And your next move doesn't need to happen for the world to feel it coming.